Hello again, everybody. This is your friendly neighborhood 80 slasher librarian. Today, we're going to be beginning Jason X The Experiment by Pat Cadigan. This book is actually a direct sequel to the movie Jason X, and the author who wrote this book also wrote the novelization of Jason X the movie. So they kept the same author to write the first sequel. So here we go. Jason X The Experiment. Prologue. Like Lucifer cast out of the heavens, Jason Voorhees fell, his arc spanning the full length of the sky all the way down to the surface of the planet. More precisely, it was as if he had actually been pushed, not by any sort of triumphant archangel wielding a flaming sword in service of a deity, but by a man who sacrificed himself by falling with him, to make certain there was no reprieve or interruption. It was the man who burned more brightly as they plunged toward the face of the world, and they were still some miles above it when the last of him was consumed. Jason Voorhees burned less easily, composed as he was of alloys impervious to all manner of destructive forces. This durability had been reinforced courtesy of the nanomachines which had integrated these materials into his original design when they had rebuilt him. Accordingly, he burned more slowly, but brightly enough for the path of his fall to be visible in the night sky to observers on the ground below. Bit by bit, he was broken down and carbonized, until the only thing left was a charred fragment, unrecognizable as anything that could once have been human. The bright streak across the sky delivered its tiny black fragment to the surface of a lake, where it rested for a short time in the shallow waters at the edge, near to a glacier-fed stream. Just a tiny fragment of him, attached to a part of his mask. For a day it lay there, in the shallows and the faint sunlight. Then the weather warmed, the glacier started to melt faster, the stream became a torrent, and the fragment and the mask were swept out and out into the lake, to the deepest and darkest center, where it fell again, through the depths into the darkness at the bottom. Cold, pressure, hundreds of feet of water pressing down. But within the core of the fragment, a tiny spark of something remained. Something that still burned with a tiny flame. Something dark and angry. Above all, evil. The cold and pressure tried to overwhelm the spark of anger and obliterate it, but it was too strong. It continued, in the remaining wreckage of what had once been indestructible, unstoppable, and yet strangely beautiful. It was a grotesque and terrible sort of beauty, malign, murderous, and unmerciful, but beauty nonetheless. Also remaining in the tiny fragment were a couple of even tinier artifacts. They were the nano-mechanisms called ants by the inhabitants of this world, several of which Jason had killed aboard a spacecraft before taking his long fall from heaven. There had been billions of ants aboard the ship, and they had created the original terrible and beautiful body, rebuilding it from organic wreckage, before withdrawing back into the reservoirs that held them after they had done their work. But 2 of them had remained in the body to perform routine maintenance and make other repairs. Only 2, but enough to begin the process of replication, to produce more ants. Even with the full complement of ants, however, there was very little in that tiny fragment with its spark of anger to work with. The problem was compounded by the environment at the bottom of the deep, dark lake, which lacked so many of the viable elements they needed to use in their rebuilding. Above all, it was cold. They had very little energy to work with, and the work was slow. But the nano-ants were both patient and persistent. They had been programmed for the task, and only for this task. Atom by atom, molecule by molecule, and eventually cell by cell. They went on with their work. That which had been cast down from the heavens and had fallen burning to earth too, was the kind of creature which only existed in myths, legends, and children's stories. But the ants didn't know. Knowing was not a part of their purpose, only rebuilding. They worked steadily, and the tiny remaining spark of anger was patient. There was plenty of time. No matter how long it took, he would rise into a world where there was much work to do, so much human flesh to rip and tear apart, to slash into bloody ruins. Jason Voorhees was coming back. He always did. Part 1, Chapter 1. With a gentle touch on the steering wheel, Lynn Bowes maneuvered her cruiser past the cluster of cable robots and wondered, not for the first time, whether being in control really made that much difference to her. It would have been so easy to flip back to automatic, put her feet up on the dash and watch the scenery go by while she listened to music. In most areas, you didn't have a choice about it. Traffic control meant auto was compulsory. Way out in rural areas like this, however, there were fewer vehicles, so you weren't bound by the necessity for constant congestion management, and you could actually drive if you wanted to. And as the owner of a perfect reproduction of a classic pre-evacuation Earth PT cruiser, meticulously designed and constructed according to the original manufacturer's specs, Lynn often wanted to. In fact, it seemed kind of a waste not to. She took a quick look in the rearview mirror at the cable robots, receding behind her in the distance, busily extending traffic control farther out. In another day or so, they would reach the new power station. On her left, she spotted the command Hummer parked just off the road with a clear line of sight to the robots. The Department of Transportation seal on the doors seemed to be newly painted. She was hoping to get a look at the interior as she went by. Hummers were so ugly, although they were cute, but the windows were at full tint. Lynn pressed her lips together briefly. The human supervisor inside was most likely taking a nap and leaving all the hard work to the bots. No need to bother with any human control. Control, power, politics. As ever, these were the heart of the matter, Lynn thought. And here she was a student at CM University, one of the top grad schools in the country, supposedly preparing herself for a career in public policy and management, and dithering as to whether she wanted to be in control of her own car. Curious paradox, or merely ironic? Let history judge, Lynn chuckled to herself. History, at least the political history of Earth 2, and what could be determined from the records of pre-evacuation Earth, gave her one answer: freedom. Of course, the records of pre-vac Earth were decidedly fragmented and missing important sections, but the recent archaeological missions back to the dead planet continued to yield new information for the historians. The records that came back might as easily be a recording of a popular singer of the early 21st century as a digital copy of a politics book, but enough was coming back to fill in important gaps in knowledge about the pre-vac planet. And no one should be sniffy about recordings of pop songs coming back, since the whole culture of Earth 2 was constantly enriched by the surviving cultural artifacts from Earth 1. It had been the founding parents who made the decision to take over wholesale the Constitution of the old United States as a model for the new planet. The Constitution had, of course, been created by the old founding fathers in a less sexually enlightened and emancipated age, 4 centuries before its reinterpretation at the practical politics of 21st century America and its wealthy allies. This had resulted in headlong increases in the greenhouse gases which had destroyed pre-vac Earth. As the warming of the planet had accelerated, the frequency of disasters such as hurricanes, droughts, floods, and killer heat waves had gone through the roof. The natural environment had collapsed, unable to support human life or much other life of any kind. It was only through the cooperation of the remaining populations that a small number of the human race had been able to evacuate and start the human diaspora. The diaspora had been assisted by encounters with aliens who had provided humans with interstellar drive, a technology which enabled them to look for a new planet to settle. For something more permanent than space habitants humanity had previously developed, mostly in the old solar system. So they had come to Earth 2, with the determination to set up a society based on ideals of freedom and human rights. Over the centuries, since the new planet had been settled, the human race had begun to grow again. Now the population and level of urbanization had grown enough to warrant the use of non-renewable energy sources. The decision to base new supplies on nuclear fission plants was a controversial one, nonetheless. There were, for example, all those difficult questions about control, which brought Lynn back to the beginning of her train of thought. It wasn't like she was the only grad student who struggled with the issues of control and freedom. But for some of her fellow students, like Peter, who shared her fascination and affection for old Earth 1 movies, it was very simple. "Better us in control than the monsters of the id," he had said after they had seen Forbidden Planet at a vintage pre-vac media festival. "Better hope we don't turn out to be the monsters as well," Lynn had replied. "I'm fine," he said, eyes twinkling. "How are you doing?" Lynn smiled to herself at the memory. How was she doing? So far, so good, and in control of her P2 cruiser at least, if nothing else. And if she were a monster, she wasn't very, well, monstrous, which was good considering that Earth 2 was refreshingly short on monsters. But then, the planet had been uninhabited, except for a healthy variety of fauna, carnivores, herbivores, and omnivores, none of them particularly nightmare-inducing. The Earth 1 refugees had to make do with monsters from the myths and legends they had brought with them. Well, she might have preferred dealing with monsters, real or imagined, than getting stuck interning with some government science project, the way Professor Morse wanted her to. He insisted she have more science credits before he could pass her for the semester. So much for her plans to take off for the mountains and spend the hottest part of the summer skiing the perfect powder on the slopes of Mount Kazmerch. Still, she supposed she couldn't complain. She had spent the earlier part of her 20s insecure and uncertain. Was she brainy enough, attractive enough, too aloof or too friendly, too driven or in need of more focus, too girly, whatever that meant, too vain, or not concerned enough about her appearance? And how did she measure up against everyone else? There had even been a time when she was around 24 when she'd found herself at a particularly disastrous series of relationships, wondering if maybe she should wear her shoulder-length blonde hair with bangs to conceal her high forehead. High foreheads were associated with being brainy, of course, which seemed to intimidate a lot of guys. Then she'd stopped herself and thought, no, I am brainy, and no way do I want to be with some jock who's scared of me being too clever. So no to bangs, but yes to looking as brainy as she really was. Now, at 28, she was finally getting the hang of how to spend more time enjoying her life, and less time agonizing about it. Although she would have enjoyed it even more if she had had someone to enjoy it with. Not that she had it in mind to settle down at this point in her life. She wasn't looking for Mr. Right, more like Mr. Right now. The problem was, it wasn't getting any easier to meet people. That was the irony of being in the prime of your life, she supposed. You were more busy than before and had less time for recreation. Between her studies and part-timing for the local weekly newspaper, she was lucky to get enough time to dream about having a social life, or a sex life. And if she did dream about the latter, she usually woke up soon, which was so unfair. Dreams weren't supposed to be anything like real life. Well, in a perfect world they wouldn't have been, and in a perfect world she wouldn't have any bills to pay either. But obviously, it wasn't a perfect world, and that fact happened to be how she managed to pay her bills. When we tell them something they didn't already know, that's news, her editor was always saying. If they already know it, that ain't news. Since no news is good news, then good news is no news. Bad is news, and scary is news. Waxy Anschutz was a throwback who fancied himself a direct descendant of the pioneers of pre-vac Earth 1 journalism, and was trying to single-handedly revive what he called the great and noble ink-stained newsrooms of yore. Exactly how he was going to accomplish that with a once-a-week hard-copy broadsheet was something he had never explained to her. But Waxy, what if the news really is good? She had asked him, indicating the front-page reproductions he had framed and put up on the walls. You have to admit that along with everything else, wars did end. The lost were found and the sick were healed. Sure, happened all the time. On page 34, somewhere behind the society page in the crossword puzzle. Don't give me a lot of grief, Bowles. Just give me news. And real news always involves something bad or scary, no matter how good it is. So here she was on her way to a 10:30 a.m. appointment with Dr. Timothy Olson, head of the new power station, to interview him for a feature that would appear on the day the station finally went live, if she did well enough. Waxy had promised to send her back to cover the formal launch, so she could witness some government fat cat proudly throwing the big switch and officially connecting the station to the national power grid. Unofficially, the station was already connected to the grid and had been for about a day, but apparently that supply of cheaper, more reliable power wouldn't be real without the ceremony, and the ceremony itself wouldn't be real unless it was in the news. And that wouldn't be news unless it had some bad or scary element. Lynn smiled to herself as she looked out over the countryside. On her left, sunlight on the river running through the heart of the valley flickered and flashed through tiny spaces in the dense woodland. On her right, the forest became even thicker, before stopping abruptly at the edge of the valley floor. The steep, almost vertical side of the valley reached up and up to the plateau level, where the forest resumed and the river wound its way down towards the heart of the sprawling Ramsey County. This was, as Lynn had learned in her undergrad geography classes, a classic area of upland glaciation. The huge lake up ahead, where the new power station was sited, was a result of a combination of glacial relic, land ships, and terminal moraine material dumped by the retreating glaciers all those millennia ago, which had dammed the valley. Amazing how unspoiled it all appeared, she thought. She might never have noticed any of the pylons if she hadn't actually been looking for them. After a while, the road began curving to the right, heading towards the valley wall, cutting through a section of woods where the tree branches were so thick overhead that they seemed to form a natural tunnel. Then the road emerged into sunlight and climbed up and up, over the natural dam, finally descending on the far side. When the road reached the decline towards the lake, the forest which grew atop the huge natural dam thinned, and Lynn was back in the bright sunlight with Veronica Lake and the power station directly in front of her. The power station was an uninspiring gray chunk of structure. Lynn felt a funny little flutter of disappointment, or perhaps even ennui at the sight of it. But then, what had she expected a power station to look like anyways? A luxury ski resort? In a perfect world, whispered her mind. She sighed. On the other hand, ennui might have been exactly what the designers had been striving for. She thought this as her gaze fell on the people gathered near the barbed wire fence several yards to the left of the front gate. If so, it didn't work on everyone. The demonstrators still weren't giving up. Lynn marveled at their tenacity. There were always a few hardcore individuals in every group who wouldn't let go of the fights, but this bunch were still turning out to march in pretty respectable numbers. New banners and place cards, too, or at least newly cleaned and repainted. "Don't kill our home again! Gaia is here, too! You are killing me! And you, too! Don't blow our second chance! There is a God, and he's mad as hell! Go find your own world to fuck up!" So many signs. Lynn smiled at the last two. United in the greater cause, yet still diverse in spirit and occasionally indecisive, but nevertheless sincere. Granted, some of the demonstrators did look a bit mechanical, like they were going through the motions on autopilot. Only to be expected when you did the same thing day in and day out, Lynn thought, chuckling silently to herself. Even saving the world was bound to become routine. Like her grandfather liked to say, same old, same old. The military guards stationed at regular intervals along the fence and on the gate looked like this was an equally as routine to them, although Lynn knew they weren't actually as blasé as they appeared to be. Certainly the demonstrators knew it too, as they were obviously being careful to maintain the legally allowed distance from the fence. The few people who felt ambitious enough to chant were sticking with the more generic kind of slogan. "Green is life. Life is green. It's not too late to turn back now," rather than anything aggressive despite the banners, which Lynn found a bit curious. Maybe they thought grunts couldn't read. She started to turn right into the parking lot, but one of the guards at the gate signaled her to drive right up to the entrance instead. Amazed, Lynn obeyed, and was even more surprised when the woman came out to meet her with a broad, welcoming smile on her face, while another one opened the gate. Either they're even more bored than I imagined, she thought, or this is the new military they keep advertising. She rolled down the driver's side window. "Lynn Bowles," she said, offering her ID card. "Ramsey County Star. I have an appointment with Dr. Olson." "Lieutenant Rena Safira," said the other woman cheerfully. She glanced at Lynn's ID card without taking it. "We were told to expect you. I used to have one of these," she added, patting the cruiser affectionately with one gloved hand. "Also in red." "Really?" Lynn said. It was the only thing she could come up with. "Still got it, actually. It's just in storage." She beckoned to one of the other guards who stepped into the booth next to the gate, and then came out again with an 8x10 waterproof envelope. The lieutenant took it from him and passed it to Lynn. "Okay, what you've got in there is some documentation and your visitor's pass, which you'll see identifies you as being from a government research facility, here on consultation." Lynn blinked at her. "It does? Why?" "Dr. Olson does not want to advertise the fact that anyone from the press has been invited in." She turned to look pointedly at the demonstrators for a moment. Things have been more or less quiet, and he doesn't want to stir anything up. Like, let them know there's a reporter on the premises. That would really get him going. Lynn couldn't stop herself from laughing a little. I'm from a locally weekly run by a guy who keeps a functioning typewriter in his office, and I'm just a part-timer working on my way through grad school. Hey, this is not my call. I'm just giving you the gospel according to Olson. If you want to keep your date with him, you'll go along with it. She tapped the envelope in Lynn's hand. Also in there is a radiation check strip. Be sure you have it with you at all times. Not likely you'll end up anywhere hotter than normal, but it's the law. She pointed at the open gate. Head straight on till you see the sign that says Management Main Reception. Pull into the lot, park anywhere, and just go on in. Someone will meet you. And thanks. Actually, I'm the one who should thank you, Lieutenant, Lynn said, feeling awkward. And you're certainly welcome, said Lieutenant Sophia, her broad grin reappearing with even more wattage. I was thanking you because you won me a nice chunk of pocket money. You see that guy over there just outside the gatehouse? She pointed at a husky uniformed man who was trying not to look disappointed and failing completely. He bet me that when you showed up, you were going to come walking out of that bunch. I said you weren't. Lynn frowned. That would have blown Dr. Olson's secrecy plan all to hell, she said. What would you have done? Well, first I'd have to give that clown my next paycheck, the guard said. After that, I really can't say, but it probably wouldn't have been pretty. She stood back and waved Lynn through. Lynn obeyed. She glanced up at the rearview mirror, almost expecting to see the lieutenant doing a victory dance. But the soldiers simply closed the gate and went back to their previous positions. At the bottom of Veronica Lake, things were changing. As the water became warmer, the nanomechanisms became more energetic, which enhanced the new, low-level radiation now present in their immediate environment. The pace of reconstruction and restoration accelerated, increasing exponentially. The available materials were different, but the nanos had been programmed to modify and adapt as necessary, and they did, without thought, without hesitation, without stopping. Lynn was seated in main management reception, sipping a cup of coffee the dark-haired man on the front desk had brought her. The coffee was pretty good, and the delay had given her time to go to the bathroom off the reception area and freshen up. However, Lynn still didn't like waiting around. She might be working for a small weekly newspaper, but she still had some illusions about the rights and powers of the press. She had been told when she got back from the bathroom that there would be a few minutes wait before she could go to Dr. Olson's office, so she used the time to scan the material she had been given at the front gate. There was the usual glossy PR stuff under the heading, New Power Working for the Nation, with sheets of background facts and figures about the power station. Some of it looked like it would only be of interest to engineers. What was that old campus joke about engineers? Oh, yes. Graffiti found on the engineering faculty wall on the second day of semester. Yesterday I couldn't spell engineer, and now I are one. That pretty well summed up Lynn's attitude to engineers, and engineering for that matter. However, given time to feel and a chance to avoid asking background factual questions in her interview, which would have been a big waste of time and really not what her editor was interested in, Lynn scanned the less technical stuff. She read that designs for the new power station were based on surviving plans from the new generation of plants introduced in the early 21st century on pre-evacuation Earth. They were less complex than plants produced over the preceding 50 years, making them safer and more efficient. For example, a major influence on the designers was the Westinghouse AP1000, supposedly 100 times safer than earlier models. It had, for example, fewer parts, 36% fewer pumps, and 83% less safety-related valves. And this meant less likelihood of something breaking. Earth 2 engineers had improved this even further, reducing the number of parts by more than 30%. Lynn had never been that good with statistics, and her eyes were glazing over. Geez, she thought. Just what the readers want. A huge info dump. If this stuff is going in any article, I'd better disguise it well, or Waxy will take my head off for boring the readers to death. She was still working out ways of doing this when the man from reception ushered her into an elevator that took her down several hundred feet and delivered her to a smiling woman waiting behind the wheel of an electric cart. She motioned Lynn into the passenger seat, introducing herself as Kit, senior PR press officer. So, thought Lynn, That would be press Kit, then. Ha ha! To Lynn, Kit didn't look old enough to be a senior anything, although that might have been the combined effect of the pixie-cut black hair and the pastel green two-piece outfit she was wearing. It seemed just a little too big for her, like something she was supposed to grow into. She certainly drove like a kid, Lynn thought, as they sped almost silently through a series of underground tunnels at a rather alarming rate of speed. "Not much traffic this time of day," the woman said brightly, "so I can really push this baby to the limit. It's good to do that once in a while, you know. Charges the battery, gets it right out of the red and into the black." "And whitens the knuckles," Lynn added silently, taking a firmer grip on the seat with both hands. "Don't worry," the woman added, as if she had caught something of Lynn's thoughts. "We're not going to run into anything else down here right now, or even just see them." Lynn managed a polite laugh. To her relief, however, the woman was telling the truth. They came to an uneventful stop, alive and well, at another bank of elevators. The ride had been so fast that Lynn had formed only a vague impression of endless gray tunnel walls, cabling, and a host of side tunnels with helpful labels, such as BS-59, which told her precisely zilch. Except perhaps that this underground complex, far below the visible building of the plant at ground level, was vast. She didn't have the foggiest idea what it was all for, and Kit waved away any questions with a laugh and the non-reply. "Search me. I just drive the main tunnels when I get a chance. Everything else is off limits to anyone except the high-security techies." Well, Lynn thought, maybe the tunnels are just there. Maybe no one knows what they are all for. They got out of the vehicle, and Kit escorted Lynn up to Timothy Olson's office. "Glad to see you survived the Grand Prix," Olson said with a quick glance at the press officer. "I hope it wasn't too much of an ordeal." Lynn laughed nervously as she shook his hand. As the head of a major power station, he was a most unimposing figure, slender, almost delicate, and she felt as if she were towering over him in her high heels. She had traded the comfort of her favorite sneakers for a more formal, professional look in the car before going in. At the moment, she didn't feel so much professional as she did gawky, a feeling not relieved by the rather courtly way that Dr. Olson tucked her hand into the crook of his arm before he turned to the door of his office. Lynn had only a few moments to enjoy this, and to wonder why none of the men she had dated in the last 10 years, since she came of age, had ever taken her arm in such an old-fashioned way. She thought that Dr. Olson had meant to open the door, but the moment he reached for it, it vanished, along with the entire wall, and she found herself staring at a spacious room that looked more like somebody's luxurious living room than a scientist's office. The entire far wall was transparent from floor to ceiling, giving a perfectly unobstructed view of the rolling green lawn stretching all the way to the shore of the lake. Olson brushed his fingertips across the transparent door in front of him, and suddenly she was seeing the room through a smoky tint. "This is one hell of a nice office you got here," Lynn said, as he finally opened the door and let her inside. "Back at the newspaper, I can't even get one little window." "This isn't really my office," Olson said, motioning for her to take a seat on the outrageously long pastel blue sofa facing the view. We use it more as a conference room." He motioned at the PR officer as he sat down beside her. In the next moment, the woman was wheeling over a cart with a full coffee service on it. Lynn suppressed the urge to make a joke about what a careful driver she had become. Olson served her with a display of old-fashioned manners that made her feel boorish as well as gawky. He couldn't have been more than 45, but he had the air, even the body language, of someone much, much older. Even the charcoal-colored suit suggested, well, not age exactly, but some of the qualities that went with it: substance, authority, even wisdom. She was starting to find him rather intimidating. And then all at once she heard Waxy's voice in her brain, so clearly that he might have been in the room with her. "Well, of course you're intimidated. He's a physically small man. Do you think he'd be running a power station if he couldn't present himself as powerful? If he hadn't figured out how to intimidate? He'd have been squashed like a bug long ago. Now get up on your hind legs like a good reporter and intimidate him right back." Smiling inwardly, Lynn set her cup on the low table in front of her and took her recorder out of her shoulder bag. "So, I'm actually here undercover as a fellow scientist," she said chattily, touching the visitor card hanging on the chain around her neck. "But at your request, so as not to stir up the protesters at the gates. As I tried to tell one of your guards, I'm not from WorldNet or PNN, or even Janet Planet's News to Use. I'm a grad student working part-time for a weekly hard copy sheet. Olson nodded politely, obviously waiting for her to go on. So why agree to an interview with, well, to be brutally honest, a nobody like me? The man's lips stretched in a slow, wary smile. I might point out that it's yourself you're being brutal to, not me, he said. You can color me surprised, put in the PR officer, practically on the heels of his words. Shoving Lynn's coffee to one side, she perched on the table opposite both of them. The last thing I ever thought I'd ever hear any journalist say was how unimportant they were. Olson chuckled and reached for a chocolate cookie. Nibbling at the cookie, saying nothing, he sat back on the couch and sipped his coffee. Personally, I blame the PR industry as a whole for this sorry state of affairs. Then the PR woman began. Or maybe it's society. Stratification, the pecking order, etc., etc. But when Dr. Olson took charge of the power station, he called us all together, all the employees, and he just laid the vision right out for us. Oh, Lord, thought Lynn, here we go with the vision thing. What chance 1,000 points of light? She started to say something, but the woman talked over her. This power station is not for the elite. It's for everyone. It's to make life better and easier for everybody. And, like all the best tools, it's supposed to do that inconspicuously, just running along in the background without fanfare or a whole lot of fuss. If it does the job right, we're all supposed to forget it's even there. Here, I mean, that's our duty, and that starts with the people of Ramsey County. She added quickly, talking over Lynn again. We're smack in the middle of where they live, which means that even though we contribute to the national grid, we are first and foremost members of this community. There's no better way to demonstrate our commitment to everyone in Ramsey County, especially to those protesters out there, than to put Ramsey County first whenever we can. In this case, to give first crack at media coverage, not to some impersonal global news mill, but to our hometown hard copy broadsheet. She punctuated her statement with a sharp, cheerful nod. And that's the living, breathing truth. Lynn gaped at her open mouth for some unmeasured time before turning to look at Olson. Does that answer your question? He said. Lynn hesitated. I guess I blame PR too, she said finally. Some people just can't handle honesty. More coffee? No thanks. She stood up as well. But you can direct me to the nearest restroom. She had expected that press kit, Lynn had to consciously avoid actually saying the appalling pun, would insist on escorting her. As she locked the stall door and sat down, Lynn wondered just how long the woman was prepared to wait. Lynn had no doubt that the PR officer and Olson both knew exactly what Lynn was up to. And it was equally likely that every bit of the email she was currently writing to Waxy was being copied to a cache in what was officially labeled their counter-espionage system. But they couldn't block it, or rather they wouldn't dare block it. Not unless they wanted the feds coming down on them for interfering with the mail. And all the while they were all politely pretending that none of them knew what was happening, or that they knew everyone else knew the same thing. This is so ridiculous, Lynn thought suddenly. How much time and effort would have been saved if they had just dispensed with the charade altogether? She was sorely tempted to pop out of the toilet stall and say, Look, we all know I'm sending my editor a copy of what I recorded you saying and telling him I've never heard such a blatant piece of bullshit, ever. Let's just skip any more screwing around, and I'll just do this interview and leave. She was on the verge of actually standing up when her phone screen lit up with Waxy's reply. It was short and to the point. Be nice, do interview, go home. Lynn sighed and flushed the toilet. The sound of water running away was the sound of any hopes of having an interesting day flushing away as well. Hi-ho, she thought. Time to be a good sport. Now, if only I had brought my sports clothes. Okay, this has been the prologue and chapter 1 of Jason X, The Experiment. I'm looking forward to this book. With it being a direct sequel to the movie, I'm very interested to see how it plays out. And to see how fast Jason is resurrected and rebuilt at the bottom of that lake. That was a pretty interesting way to start the book. Be sure to subscribe, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and please click that bell so you're updated when new chapters drop. I'll be back soon with some more chapters to Jason X, The Experiment. Until then, thanks for listening.